This is a track analysis and production breakdown of my original song, Glitchhouse. My initial inspiration for this track was to blend elements of witch house, techno and house music to create a post-genre style song for my portfolio. The track started with this sample from a witch house sample pack on Splice. I reversed the sample, pitched it up 3 semitones, and that sounds like this. I noticed the sound was very bright and metallic and wanted to control some of this, so I applied a high pass filter to remove some mud, some multiband dynamics, a dynamic surgical EQ using the plugin Soothe, just to smooth out some of those frequencies while also retaining the core value of the sound, and then applied sidechain compression from the kick and some effects that happen later in the track. The drums follow a core 4 on the floor kick pattern, which is typical of techno music. I then applied a sample from a drum and bass sample pack, pitched it up 13 semitones to emulate more of a bright metallic sound, but I noticed the end of the sample had this roll which was a bit distracting. So I reversed this, lowered the gain, and it creates almost a sweep into the next bar. I then added another sample from this pack but chopped it up to create fills, pitched this up 9 semitones and applied a harsh effect to spread it out across the stereo field and create some more space within the drums. The last major part of the drum progression is this salt grinder. I was listening to my work in progress while cooking and started grinding the salt grinder at an 8th note pattern, more as a joke than anything, and then I noticed it could potentially sound quite cool. So I recorded it at my desk with an SM57, applied a bit crusher and an auto pan to spread it around the listener's head, and that sounds like this. The main bass line stays consistent throughout the track in terms of melody, however I noticed this might become quite fatiguing for the listener. It's a simple respace, however I wanted to add more movement, so I created a parallel chain utilising 8 LFOs, each mapped to one singular point of the EQ, and each one is using a randomised waveform to affect the frequency position, the gain, and the cue point of each frequency. This was pretty extreme as you do get some randomised results, and so I added a limiter, a phaser, some multiband dynamics just to control the sound a little bit. I blended this in at -20 dB and I feel it adds more movement to the bass, making it more notable. The only other bass element is this mid bass with an LFO affecting the wavetable position and volume, creating a slightly fluttered effect, and that sounds like this. The first lead part that can be heard in the track is this sawtooth melody that I wrote in MIDI and then bounced out to audio. I noticed I wanted to add more rhythmic dynamics to the part as it felt kind of flat, which I achieved by using Ableton's Beats warp algorithm at gated 16th note granular resolution and using a short transient envelope around 30 to create stuttered 16th note, almost sidechain gating effects. This sounds like this. I used a harsh effect to spread the sound out across the stereo field and a hybrid reverb with 0 millisecond pre-delay to create a slightly more washed sound, but blended this in a parallel chain at -6 decibels. I then added a phaser just to give it a little bit more movement. The next lead element is this arpeggio that I wrote. It's pretty simple in terms of the melody itself, however the processing, I've added an LFO with a sine wave affecting the rate of an auto pan so that it again creates more dynamic movement, specifically in terms of the stereo field around the listener's head, and this sounds like this. The main vocals of the track are a Splice sample. I knew I wanted a high female vocal, which is more typical of witch house artists such as Crystal Castles and Crimes, and thankfully the sample I found happened to have an accompanying lower octave, so the high sounds like this, blended with the low. I felt this just filled out the sound a little more. There's no major processing happening here, just some EQ and a little bit of OTT to compress the sound. I then chopped up singular words or phrases from the vocal to create ad-libs. I pitched these differently to create some more dynamic variants, utilised automation on the panning and sends to create vocal throws, and even pitched in some parts singular words or vowels up and down to create melodies, and I feel like this added a more unique quality to the ad-libs. They sound like this. There's a subtle background vocal effect, which is just a vocal chant with quite a lot of EQ and reverb happening. It's supposed to be more of a background washed effect to just enrich the sonic quality of this part. It sounds like this. The final element to this track is the effects group. I wanted to create a dynamic syncopated rhythmic pattern that incorporated a variety of textural and tonal elements. I utilised automation, particularly within the panning parameters, to create balance between the elements across the stereo field, and from a mixing perspective, I achieved balance by grouping the tracks into their relative tonal and textural elements, such as percussive, kicks and lows, ambient effects, and bass one-shots. Not only did this mean I had more control over each of the individual tonal elements, and thus achieved a cleaner mix within this section, but also it just improved the efficiency of my workflow. Rather than having to dive in individual sample by sample within one track, I had a lot more space to mix them individually within their own track lanes. As one of my aims when branding myself as a post-genre producer is to incorporate my creative electronic production techniques into a variety of genre, I feel like this approach enabled me to do this well and highlighted my versatility. However, it's also important that each of the individual elements retain their core sounds and core textures, as this is an element I really like to focus on also. Altogether, this section sounds like this. And in context, and that's the track.